What's up? Hope you are doing well. This is Finx MTG here with a deck tech on Belbe Corrupted Observer, the zombie elf, which, if you're into the lore, has a very sad but interesting story. But aside from that, this is a power level 6 deck for Commander. It's not really top tier, but it has a lot of budget cards in it, and you're able to do a lot of crazy stuff that you're not usually able to do in a budget deck. And the idea is simple. You get this card onto the battlefield. It's a 2/2, but the ability has a symmetrical effect on the table and it affects everybody, not just you. The idea is that when one of your opponents take damage, when you get to your post-combat main phase, your second main phase, you get 2 colorless mana for each player that took the damage that turn. So in that way, if you're dealing damage to 3 of your opponents, on your turn, second main phase, you get 6 colorless mana. That's a lot of free mana to work with. Now again, this is symmetrical, so it also works with the other players where they can trigger the effect as long as Belbe's in play. And if they're hitting not you, but your opponents, they can get colorless mana as well. And if they have a fetch land to hurt themselves, they can get an additional 2 colorless there. So it also encourages the opponents to actually attack the other players at the table and not you, which is another good thing. So again, if you want to see the full deck tech on this, I'll put it in the notes in the description and also some details on the power level. And again, we'll go through the main items of the 99 cards in this deck, how it's put together, and what it does. So the idea is to get this main card out. And then for the win conditions, what we're really going for is creature damage and having these huge creatures in play. As you can see, 9 mana Phyrexian Triniform here. These cost a lot of mana, but once you get in and you start punching for 9, it does some work. So this one also, when it dies, it creates 9 mana value of golems, and it has Encore, which means you can bring it back from the graveyard. So these are some of the main payoff spells that you can go, and the way to win with this deck is through combat damage, which takes a little bit of time, but because you're getting started on turn 2, 3, 4, you should be able to get in there with a lot of damage. Next up, we have Apex Devastator. This is another crazy card here. For 10 mana, you get a 10/10. But the big item here is that it has 4 instances of Cascade. So because Belbe is cheating cards into play, but you're actually casting them, it's triggering the Cascade effect. And most of the cards in this deck have a very high mana value, so you're getting some big hits off of this, and you can put some huge creatures in play to close out the game pretty quickly. One of those would be something like this here, the Tarrasque. So this one, when it's cast, which is a great little line of text right here. When it's cast, it has Ward 10. So basically nobody can touch it, and it also has haste. Nobody's going to have 10 mana to just be able to then cast a spell after it to do this. Whenever it attacks, it also fights target creature defending player controls, and it's a 10/10. If you get this out early and you start eliminating the opponent's boards, it makes it very hard for them to come back. Another one, we have Stonehoof Chieftain. This is an 8/8 trample indestructible, and again, there's not a lot of cards in this deck that are expensive mana-wise, or expensive money-wise, but mana-wise, they are high on cost. So this card does a lot of work in this deck, but it's still budget-friendly, which is very nice. Trample Indestructible, whenever another creature you control attacks, it gains Trample and Indestructible until end of turn. So that lets your big boys get through and deal the damage to close out the game. Sandworm Convergence. You usually want to wait to play this card, because this is basically like a win condition. If they don't have an answer for this, you're making a 5/5 on every end step, and eventually you're going to have enough 5/5 sandworms like Dune to go and take over the game and win. It also has the effect of creatures with flying can't attack you or planeswalkers you control, which is very good against certain blue decks or the dragon decks that are out there. And then we have Exsanguinate. So this is the last one here. If you need just to close out the game, or if you're just struggling and you took a lot of damage, you cast this card to gain a lot of life back, because each opponent that loses X life, you gain that much life. So if you're even just doing this for 6 mana plus 2 black, each opponent gets drained for 6, and you get 18 life back. Or it can close out the game. So we have the big win conditions there. But the thing is, how do we actually trigger that? Now the trick is to use cards that we call they're like basically ping effects. So Vicious Conquistador is a great example of that. Vicious Conquistador. It's a 1/2, so it can't just take 1 damage and die. That's why I put this one a little bit up on the scale. There's a lot of different options here. When it attacks, though, each opponent loses 1 life. Turn 1, you play Vicious Conquistador. Turn 2, you play Belbe, Corrupted Observer. And next thing you know, when you attack in your second main phase, you're going to get 6 colorless mana right there. And you can cast, whatever spell you want for 6 mana. And it can go on the turns again and again after that. Next up, we have Pulse Tracker. Similar to the other one, it's a 1/1 though. When it attacks, each opponent loses 1 life. Then we have Thornbow Archer. It's a 1/2, but when it attacks, each opponent who doesn't control an elf loses 1 life, and sometimes people use the mana dorks that are running an elf deck, so it doesn't always hit all opponents. That's why that's not the highest rated. Night Market Lookout. When it becomes tapped, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. Doesn't even need to attack. Mardu Shadow Spear. This one, when it attacks, each opponent loses 1 life. But if you're in a situation where they have something on the board that can kill creatures, or it's just not safe to leave a creature out that has summoning sickness, you can use the dash cost on this and still trigger your Belbe here and be able to play a big spell. And this goes back to your hand after combat. At the beginning of the next end step, it actually comes back to your hand. So it remains safe during the opponent's turns here. So if you get late game and you still need to get in for the damage, you can sneak these in as well. And then Vicious Rumors. This is a card that does everything we want to do in this deck here. It deals 1 damage to each opponent, triggers Belbe off of that. Each opponent discards a card, then puts the top card of their library into their graveyard, and you gain 1 life. So again, you're taking resources away from the opponents. You can also cast this if they use something like a Vampiric Tutor or something to put something on the top of their library, one of their best cards. And when you put items into their graveyard, if it's a creature card, there's ways in this deck to bring them back as well. Sanctum of Stone Fangs. Now this one costs 2 mana, so you're not able to do your big trick plays on the early turn of turn 2 or turn 3. But when you get this one out, nobody's going to waste a removal spell on a enchantment that's just pinging everybody for 1 life. And that's the trick here. Sometimes you have to say, I only have 1 shrine in the deck, because people will think that you're running a shrine deck and think it might be more important than it really is. Limdul's Hex, a nice Ice Age older card. It deals 1 damage to each player. Each player may pay 1 black or 3 colorless to prevent the damage to himself or herself. So there, it's either attacks or they take the damage and it triggers your Belbe. Plague Spitter. At the beginning of your upkeep, it deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. And then when it's put into the graveyard, deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. Next up, we have Loyal Subordinate. 3 mana. At the beginning of combat on your turn, which is important, if you control your commander, each opponent loses 3 life. So pretty much you can put this out and you're going to be playing your commander because you need the commander to do the effect that you want to do. 3 life is a lot of life to lose. It's also a 3/1 with Menace. So you can sneak in and hit an opponent if you need to and deal some more damage. But if there's anything else, anybody else has another deck with some kind of sacrifice triggers or Blood Artist, those type of effects, this is going to add to that damage and it's going to put a clock on the entire table. And we also have a 6 mana Staff of Nin that you don't really play this in the beginning. You wait till you get a trigger off of Belbe and you cast this card at the beginning of your upkeep. It's giving you additional card draw, and it also has the advantage of dealing 1 damage to target creature or player when you tap it. So again, it's an artifact, so you can do that right away. And if not, you can do it to trigger one of the Belbe triggers. Or you could take away some of the opponent's little 1/1s that are annoying mana dorks or something like that. Then we have Shepherd of Rot, 2 mana, 1/1. Tap it. Each player loses 1 life for each zombie in play. This is good because you're really only doing it for 1, or if Belbe's out, 2 life. It's not really melting the table with the life, but it's triggering Belbe. Witherbloom Apprentice. There are combos with this card if you want to go to a higher power level. And again, one of the great things with this deck is that it can pretty much be at any power level that you'd like it to be at. This one in particular is a 6, but you can go all the way up to almost cEDH here. There are some cEDH versions that are a little outdated, and they have this and Chain of Smog as a 4 mana I win the game effect. You can look into that if you want to, but whenever you cast a spell, each opponent loses 1 life, you gain 1 life. So it's another way to trigger Belbe. And there we have our pingers that are also what are the enablers for Belbe. Put that right there. So when you have the 6 mana, what do you do with the first 6 mana, right? Boom. Imagine playing a Conduit of Ruin on turn 2. That's a pretty crazy effect right there. It also lets you basically tutor up a mana cost 7 or greater colorless creature card and put it on top of your library. And then it makes each creature spell you cast each turn cost 2 less to cast. So some of the effects that are more than 6 mana, some of the big creatures you have in this deck, are even easier to cast once this is in play. Scuttling Doom Engine. Can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, and it's a 6/6. So it's funny when some of the decks have just tokens, right? And this can sneak in there for a lot of damage. And the thing is, when it dies, you can also throw it at somebody here for 6 damage to target opponent on the death effect. So it really is nice to get in a lot of extra damage with this one when you need to. Steel Hellkite. If anybody has stacks of effects or anything that's annoying you on the board that you need to get rid of, it's enchantments and artifacts or just a ton of small creatures, you hit them with this 5/5, and then you pay X mana. So let's say they have a whole bunch of 2 mana cost creatures. You pay 2, and it destroys each permanent with that converted mana cost that they own. Good way to wipe their board there and also attack for damage. Soul of New Phyrexia, 6/6 trample. Permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. Is a nice effect right there. And if you exile them from your graveyard, you can also give your permanents indestructible. So this is great because even when it dies, it still gives you utility value from the graveyard. And there's a lot of times when you have a lot of big creatures out, people are going to want to get rid of them. And if they don't have something like Toxic Deluge for a crazy amount of mana, or a crazy amount of life, then they're not going to be able to get rid of them as long as you have the mana open for this card right here in your graveyard. And then Wormcoil Engine. 6/6 Death Touch Lifelink. You do need some lifelink in this deck because sometimes you start taking some damage early on if your plan doesn't go accordingly. When it dies, it makes some more tokens that also have the Death Touch Lifelink. And then boom, we have the one stack piece that we're really allowing in the deck here. God Pharaoh's Statue, just because it's so good with this deck. If you get this out on turn 2, that is the best possible thing that you can do in this deck. Spells your opponent's cast cost 2 more to cast. At the beginning of your end step, each opponent loses 1 life. The second clause is not really important, but making every spell the opponent casts cost 2 more to cast, putting them effectively 2 turns behind. And if you get that out on turn 2, by the time they catch up, you should be casting huge creatures and have half of their life gone already. So that is in there, and yes, it's a little salty because it is a stacks card, but it's not a stacks build here. This is just one of the cards that's a big payoff that we have in here. Okay, Conduit of Ruin going here. We also have a lot of other big creatures and effects that we can do. We have Maelstrom Colossus, a 7/7 Cascade. Stonecoil Serpent. The great thing about this, however much mana you have for however late you are in the game, you can just dump it into this card and it enters with that many +1/+1 counters on it. And because it has protection from multicolored, people's commanders aren't going to be able to block it, and a lot of their creatures aren't going to be able to block it. And again, it can get through because it has trample. It also protects you with reach. Primordial Hydra. This card is actually even pretty good if you just cast it for 4 total mana. The X is the amount of counters on it. And then on your upkeep, you just keep doubling the amount of counters every upkeep. So it gets big really quickly. And it has trample as long as there are 10 or more counters on it. So you either pump as much as you have, or you just cast it normal from your hand. Even if you weren't able to trigger Belbe here, you can just cast it as it is for 4 mana, and it still does a lot of work. Vilis, Broker of Blood, an 8 mana card here. Pay 2 life, target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. Also pay a black for that, but it's a flying 8/8. Whenever you lose life, draw that many cards. So you can start removing items from the opponent's board here. When you take damage from the opponent's creatures, you would also be drawing cards. And you need ways to draw cards in this deck because one of the problems is that you kind of dump out your hand quickly here, and then without refilling it, you can be in a situation where you top deck and you do not want that. Dawnglade Regent, 7 mana, 8/8. When it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch, and as long as you're the monarch, permanents you control have hexproof. People start realizing what Belbe's doing, and they want to get rid of her, or they want to get rid of the big creatures that came into play. Well, it's going to be much harder if you have hexproof and you're drawing an extra card because of monarch every turn. And then this one is a little bit of a salty card as well. You can switch this out for another card if you so choose, but it's a 8 mana, 6/6 flying, but the abilities on this are just really crazy. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, discards a card, loses 3 life, and then you draw a card and gain 3 life. So that's pretty incredible features right there. And when you're playing that on turn 3 or something like that, and you start swinging with it, it can do a lot of damage. So those are some of the other effects that we have. And we'll go into also, if the plan doesn't work with the enablers here, we also have ways to get larger amounts of mana with our mana rocks and mana ramp. We have Soul Ring, nice beautiful art there from a secret layer. Everyone's standard Arcane Signet. Talisman of Resilience. Skyclave Relic is a fun one. If you trigger Belbe, you can pay the kicker cost for 6, and it comes in with 2 additional tapped tokens of it. So then on the next turn, you can tap for 3 additional mana, and they all have Indestructible. So you either cast it for 3 if you can't trigger Belbe. If you can trigger Belbe and get 6 colorless, you put it in for 3 copies. Hedron Archive is a nice one. Hedron Archive. 4 mana, tap, add 2 colorless to your mana pool, and then when you start running low on cards, pay 2 mana, sacrifice it, draw 2 new cards. So it's good to refill your hand there. It's always a helpful addition. Gilded Lotus, sometimes you're really in need of something like black mana in this deck, especially to cast some of those big creature spells. This card, you can use your 6 colorless on turn 2 to get it out. Turn 3, you pretty much can cast anything that you want in your deck with the additional 3 mana of any one color that comes from this. And then we have a fun card for Commander, Coveted Jewel. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 3 cards. You're refilling your hand. You tap it, add 3 mana of any one color. So think about this. When you spend the 6 mana from the Belbe trigger and cast this, you're already getting 3 of that back there. So that's pretty incredible. And when you're getting big creatures on your board, it's hard for somebody to get the second trigger to work here. Whenever 1 or more creatures an opponent controls attack you and aren't blocked, that player draws 3 cards and gains control of Coveted Jewel and untaps. So this does end up switching around the table a bit, but you can get it back with your big creatures with Trample. And Dreamstone Hedron. So this one, add 3 to your mana pool, sacrifice it, and you draw 3 cards, similar to the other one that we had. And those are our different mana rocks. And again, you can also cast these with these 6 from Belbe, and it really helps out to have really explosive turns there. So we have a number of our mana fixers here. And then, of course, there's some fun Planeswalker cards that you can play. So Tavesh Zat, Doom of Fools, just an incredible Planeswalker to be able to get creatures on the board. Even if you just have to block other people's attacks, you can make the Thralls. But the favorite one here is that make Thralls, then sacrifice them, and then you draw cards. That's what you really want to do. If you get to the ultimate, that's pretty much game ending if you're able to cast that, if you're able to have that resolve. Ugin the Ineffable. You can also, whoa, easy over there. You can also sacrifice your pingers to the +1 effect on this card, which makes it also very good when you don't need them anymore. Ugin the Ineffable. So this is 6 mana, but it makes your colorless spells cost 2 less to cast, which is great in this deck because it synergizes with all of those other huge spells and artifacts that we want to cast. And there's a quasi card draw in this, right? You +1, put a 2/2 colorless spirit creature token onto the battlefield, and you take the top card of your deck, and that becomes that creature. When it dies, it goes to your hand. So you have card draw. You keep +1, keep +1, keep building a board of 2/2 spirit tokens. Then when somebody board wipes, you get all those cards to your hand. And if in an emergency, you have -3, destroy target permanent that's 1 or more colors. So you have a remove anything kind of card there. Ugin the Spirit Dragon, really powerful. The +2, it deals 3 damage to target creature or player. That's always helpful. But the big one here in this deck is that if the game gets a little out of your control, this has 7 loyalty, right? When it comes in, you can pay -X, exile each permanent with converted mana cost X or less that's 1 or more colors, which is really good here because you can, a lot of times, -5, clear the entire board of everything, and he's still on the board to start ticking up every turn. And when he ticks up, he's defending you, he's putting damage on other players, and if you get some other creatures out to protect him, you can get a -10 ultimate, draw 7 cards, and put up to 7 permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. Pretty much should win you the game as well. So there we have our Planeswalkers. There's some other cards that have some nice synergies as well. We have Blade Griff Prototype for another card with some synergy. When it deals combat damage to a player, destroy target non-land permanent of that player's choice that one of your opponents chooses. So you're not choosing the card, your opponent is. But if one player starts getting out of hand, you hit another player for a little bit of damage, and then they can start blowing up the permanents of the guy that is really getting ahead in the game. Realm Seekers. This is a fun card, 6 mana. Enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is the total number of cards in all players' hands. So keep in mind, if you're getting this out early on the first few turns, a lot of times people will still have a hand of 5 or more cards, and this comes in, with as a 20/20 with counters on it. And then you can remove counters to start getting lands out of your library and put them into your hand, so you don't miss any land drops there either. So it makes sure that it's a huge attacker that's on the board, and it also sets you up for later in the game. Also just a fun card to play with. Reanimate, the staple. Graveyard recursion card, so put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Again, if you're killing other people's items and they end up in the graveyard, you can reanimate them, or you reanimate one of your big boys and do some work. Chord of Ambition, an enchantment, which means it's harder to remove. This is also one of the pingers and the enablers for Belbe. So when it enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. You get extra card draw there, so that's good. But at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card. So either they're giving up resources or they're going to give you the Belbe trigger. And the thing is, if you're the monarch, they lose 6 life and would have to discard 2 cards to ignore that effect, which is not really realistic to be able to discard 2 cards every time it gets to your upkeep. So this can be very powerful if you're able to protect that monarch with your huge creatures. Manglehorn. Enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact, and artifacts your opponents control enter the battlefield tapped. This slows down those treasure decks. They really want to get a whole bunch of treasures out and use them right away. This says, well, the best you can do now is wait at least until next turn to use those treasures, because they have to tap before they are sacrificed. Also good targeted removal. Oh, speaking of removal, let's see what other removal cards we have in here. We have Nature's Claim. Very simple, 1 green mana, destroy target artifact and enchantment. Its controller gains 4 life. Nobody cares about the life gain. Beast Within. Any permanent that's giving you trouble, including some land that they're doing some crazy combo with, you can remove it with Beast Within. Golgari Charm destroys an enchantment, which can be tough to get rid of. Or you can regenerate each creature you control. So you have Belbe and 2 big creatures on the board, and they think they're lucky here. They have a Wrath of God effect, and they try and take you out. Or they have an effect that doesn't affect the regeneration. That would be better, because then you can use Golgari Charm and you can save all your creatures. Pestilence. 4 mana, but this also acts as a bit of a board wipe. If you're in a situation where you're behind, there's a lot of creatures on board, you can just get this into play and just keep doing 1 damage. You can stack up the triggers each time, do 1 damage to each creature and to both players, or to all players. This is an older version of this card. When is this from? Is this unlimited? It looks like an unlimited card here. So this one also can trigger Belbe, because Belbe is a 2/2, which is very good, because that means that you can do 1 damage, trigger Belbe, and she's still alive. Culling Ritual. Now this is one of the cards that you can switch out for a card like Toxic Deluge if you want, this card. But this card's not actually in the deck, but this is something you can switch in for Toxic Deluge depending on the play group. Destroy each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less. All the opponent's mana rocks, all their tokens, all their early creatures that came out. And you add 1 black or 1 green for each permanent destroyed in this way. The fun thing with this card is, first of all, you need to kill 4 of your opponent's items, or just even your items, because this will kill Belbe if it comes out, just to break even. But anything over 4 on the board that you're killing means you're gaining mana. And again, if you want to play something that's 9 mana and you're not able to do the Belbe triggers, then how are you going to get there, right? You need a way, and I've had Culling Ritual be the way to get to cast cards with 9-10 mana cost and be able to get them out. So it's nice for that effect, and also a semi-board wipe. Assassin's Trophy. Destroy target permanent and opponent controls, and they get a land into play. It's a basic land, so it's not the worst. It's untapped. But again, this is like one of my favorite black and green removals, because it just targets anything that you need to. And it's cheap. Kenra's Transformation, another removal card. If they have a commander that they really need to do some type of combo with their deck, then they can have this on it. It becomes an elk, and they lose all abilities and they can't do anything. Of course, they can block with it eventually and get it back, but it slows the opponents down and it replaces itself when it comes out. So again, with that replacement effect, it's nice to, you cast this, you're slowing them down, and you're still maintaining the momentum, which is the big feature here. Damnation from a secret layer art here. Destroy all creatures that can't be regenerated, which means you can't use your Golgari charm if you had it. But you do need some board wipes in here, and this one is the simplest one, other than Toxic Deluge is the other easy one that goes into these type of decks usually. So we have our removal package there. And the opponents sometimes, they want to remove your cards as well, right? So you need some type of protection. This is one of those, right? We have Malakir Rebirth. Choose target creature. You lose 2 life. Until end of turn, that creature gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. So, for 1 black mana, it also can be a land if you need it to be a land. But for 1 black mana, paying 2 life, you can protect one of your biggest creatures. Very affordable way to save a 10 mana cost creature. Rushed Rebirth. You know they're going to kill one of your big creatures, so why not make it so that when it dies this turn at instant speed, so when they cast a removal spell, you cast this on one of your big creatures, you get a creature with mana value, and then you enter onto the battlefield tapped and shuffle. Next up, we have Autumn's Veil. Spells you control can't be countered by blue or black spells this turn, and creatures you control can't be the target of blue or black spells this turn. So this is the cheaper version of Veil of Summer. Veil of Summer, of course, lets you draw a card as well, so it's a little bit better. But this is the budget one, and if you're playing against a deck with counter spells, you really need your big creatures to get through, because otherwise you're not going to have anything on the board. If you get these countered, it's a bit of a problem, right? So you use this for protection of your spells. So we have a few protection spells there. We also have some other creatures and some effects to draw cards, because again, we were running into issues where we're going to run out of cards in our hand. We're playing the Enabler, we're playing Belbe, we're dropping these big mana rocks, these big mana creatures. We need to draw some more cards. Mindblade Render, whenever opponents are dealt damage, if any of that damage is dealt by a warrior, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. It doesn't matter if you're attacking or somebody else. If it's a warrior, which this one is, you get to draw the card. Return of the Wild Speaker. I like this one because for 5 mana, you draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control. So when you have a 9/9 on the board, you're drawing 9 cards here. And if you just need a finisher, you can give your creatures +3/+3 until end of turn. Deadly Dispute. This is another example here that we have so many examples of power creep in Magic, right? So if you want the super budget version of this, it's Costly Plunder, which is 25 cents or so. Deadly Dispute is currently going for around $2 to $3. 2 mana, instant speed. As an additional cost to this spell, sacrifice an artifact or creature, you draw 2 cards and create a treasure token. Costly Plunder does not make that treasure token, and for that's why it's a fraction of the cost. But the additional cost on this is that if an opponent is targeting one of your creatures or one of your artifacts for destruction, you play this spell and you get some value on it before it is destroyed. Rankle, Master of Pranks. 4 mana, Flying Haste. Deals combat damage to a player. You can choose the option. Each player loses 1 life and draws a card. If you already have a lock on the board and you have some big creatures out and you just need to run the clock down on the opponents doing damage, you can make each player discard a card, or you can make each player sacrifices a creature. So depending on the board state is how you're going to use this one. And I noticed the Flying Haste, it really surprises people. They're not ready for something like this from a black mana source or black mana deck. Damnable Pact. 2 mana X. Target player draws X cards and loses X life. In a normal deck, that is kind of scary, but when you have Belbe and you can put X as 6 very easily, you're drawing 6 cards, losing 6 life for 8 mana, and it resets your whole game and you can come back. Village Rites. As an additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice a creature. Again, if your creature is targeted or something like that, you play this card in response, you sacrifice the creature, draw 2 cards. And it's an additional cost, so as soon as it's being cast, you're already sacrificing the creature. And then we have our generic and affordable Diabolic Tutor. For 4 mana, search your library for a card, put the card into your hand, then shuffle your library. If you do this on the turn where you have 6 Belbe mana, you can directly put into play a 6 mana cost card, or if you need to, you can set up for next turn. All right, and there you have some card draw and other synergies for the deck. And Then we have, what's left here? We have the mana base. So for the mana base, we kept it really simple on this one. There's only 4 cards here that are abnormal mana, or specialty lands. We have the command tower from the, what is this, Commander Collection green style. We have Commander Legends Undergrowth Stadium, Land of War Waste, and tap for either color, but it deals damage to you for a pain land. We have the Shockland Overgrown Tomb. And with that, I pretty much, if you don't have the mana, then it's not that big of a deal at power level 6. We just have all other basic lands on here again. So if you want to see the full deck list, check out the notes. But that's pretty much the concept of Belbe here. And for just one other feature, I just want to show what happens when you get, let's say, a nice hand that you have. So if you have a Vicious Conquistador in your hand, right? And let's just say you have the 2 good mana sources here. You can get, what do we got for, we need a nice card that we can cast, like an artifact, an Archon of Cruelty. Oh, you know what? We should do the, so imagine you have the God Pharaoh statue, right? Turn 1, play Overgrown Tomb if you want. You can shock it in. You can play Vicious Conquistador. Turn 2, you play the Land of War Elves. You can tap for 2 mana here. As you can see, this craziness on all the cards I have. Put Belbe in. You attack with Vicious Conquistador. Trigger Belbe. Second main, you get, again, each opponent took damage from this ability. You get 6 colorless, God Pharaoh statue. And then if you have anything else in your hand that's a big creature, any of these guys, eventually you're going to be able to play this when nobody else is going to be able to play any effects, and you swing in and attack for a lot of damage. It's more fun just going straight to the creatures, but this one's also pretty brutal for your opponents to come back. So there you have the Belbe Corrupted Observer deck. I hope you enjoyed this deck tech. Have a great day.